I never should have taken that night job at the old city hospital. Since my first shift, something in the air felt different, as if the whispers in the empty hallways were trying to tell me something. "You are not alone," they seemed to warn. And it didn't take me long to discover how true those whispers were. It was a particularly cold October night, the kind of cold that creeps under the skin and freezes every breath. My shift was starting at midnight, and as usual, the hospital was shrouded in almost palpable darkness. Only the emergency lights offered a dim guide through the long corridors. I walked through the east wing, where the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. Although the place had been uninhabited for months, each step echoed with the echo of past voices. The empty rooms on either side of the hallway seemed to watch me, as if they harbored memories eager to be recalled. My first task of the evening was to verify that all entrances were secure. As I made my way to the back door, the sound of something shuffling stopped me. It was subtle, like the rustle of fabrics on the worn floor. I stopped, my heart beating frantically, and listened carefully. Nothing. Maybe it was just my nerves, or the old building settling on its foundation. But when I turned around, the sound was repeated, this time accompanied by a cold gust of wind that made the doors of the rooms shake. I decided to investigate, thinking that perhaps an animal had found shelter in the building. I headed toward the source of the sound, one of the old treatment rooms at the end of the hallway. I pushed the door cautiously, and the creaking of the hinges echoed like a scream in the stillness of the hospital. What I saw inside, illuminated by the faint light of my flashlight, was nothing out of this world. Shadows danced on the walls as if mocking my disbelief. Fear pinned me to the spot, as my mind struggled to make sense of the dark figure that seemed to vanish with every blink of an eye. Then the door slammed shut behind me, and I knew my life would never be the same again. After the thud of the door slamming shut behind me, I found myself in almost total darkness. The cold air enveloped me, and my accelerated breathing was the only sound in the room. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that it must just be a problem with the door or, at worst, a prankster in the hospital. But, deep inside me, I knew something more sinister was lurking in the shadows. I turned on my flashlight, whose quivering beam of light barely cut through the darkness. The walls of the room, once white, were now peeling and stained, as if time and neglect had corrupted them. Old stretchers were strewn haphazardly, some overturned, others still standing like specters of a past that refused to die. At the back, I noticed a strange arrangement, a circle of chairs facing each other, and in the center, a pile of old files and photographs strewn about. Cautiously, I approached the circle. The photos showed hospital patients, blurry but vivid images, where the eyes of the subjects seemed to follow me with a piercing, accusing gaze. Among the papers, I found a diary, its leather cover worn by time. As I opened it, an inexplicable gust of wind fluttered the pages again, stopping at an entry dated many years ago. The journal appeared to belong to a hospital doctor, who detailed unethical experiments and treatments performed on patients suffering from mental illness. Each entry was more disturbing than the last, describing painful procedures with no medical justification, carried out in the very room I was in. As I read, the sounds began again. This time, they were not just whispers or the rubbing of cloth, but distinct, clear murmurs that seemed to come from the chairs around the circle. "Why did you leave us?" a faint but accusing female voice was saying. "Why didn't you save us?" asked another, graver and more pained. As I looked up at the chairs, the beam of my flashlight briefly illuminated ethereal figures sitting in them, fading as quickly as they had appeared. Fear gripped me, and every fiber of my being screamed at me to flee that nightmarish place. But just as I was about to run for the door, something stopped me. An icy chill gripped my ankles, and a voice, clearer than the others, whispered directly in my ear, "You can't leave, you haven't seen everything yet." Paralyzed with terror, but unable to resist that voice, I slowly turned toward the center of the circle, where papers and photos began to rise up in a chaotic whirl, revealing what really happened in that dark corner of the hospital. In the swirl of papers and photographs, something more solid began to form in front of me. It was a figure made of the same shadows that enveloped the room, its contours oscillating as if composed of a dense, dark fog. The figure solidified more and more, taking the shape of a tall man, dressed in an old doctor's uniform. His eyes, completely white, stared at me, paralyzing me with bone-deep fear. "You've come for answers, haven't you?" His voice was low, echoing through the room as if coming from all directions at once. I nodded, unable to articulate a word, my mind struggling to process the reality of what I was witnessing. The specter took a step forward, the papers on the floor swirling around it, as if propelled by an invisible force. "This place is marked by the pain and despair of those who could never leave it. And now, you too are part of this history." Without knowing how, I found myself holding the journal once again, but this time, the pages were moving on their own, stopping at a particular entry. It was a detailed description of an experiment, the last one that had been conducted in that room. The experiment had ended in tragedy, with the death of a patient and the unexplained disappearance of the doctor responsible, the same one who now seemed to be standing in front of me. "Read," the figure commanded, and my gaze fell on the page. It detailed an experimental procedure intended to erase traumatic memory, but instead, it had triggered something much darker and more powerful. Something that had left a permanent imprint on the hospital, trapping the souls of those who had been part of the experiments. As I read, the whispers began to increase in volume, becoming clamorous voices that filled the room. I could hear the pain and confusion in every word, the pleas of patients who had suffered at the hands of the doctor who now confronted me. The atmosphere was charged with a palpable energy, a swirl of trapped emotions that seemed to demand justice, or at least acknowledgement of their suffering. With each word read, the figure became more defined, more real. "Do you understand now?" he asked. "This place will not let you go easily. Not without you facing the truths hidden in these walls." The air grew colder, and I felt a pressure in my chest, a tightness that made breathing difficult. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, closing in on me. I wasn't sure I could get out of there, but I knew I had to try. With a superhuman effort, I closed the diary and headed for the door, each step a struggle against the tide of voices that now cried out, imploring to be heard. Just when I thought I could stand it no longer, I reached for the door handle. I turned it with trembling hands, hoping to feel the cool night air. But as I opened the door, what awaited me was not freedom, but another, even more terrifying revelation. As I opened the door, instead of finding the exit, I found myself facing a corridor I didn't remember seeing before. This corridor was bathed in a dim, reddish light that seemed to emanate from no visible source, creating an ominous effect that made the peeling walls appear to be covered in dried blood. The air was charged with a metallic smell, and the silence was so heavy that every step I took echoed like an echo in the void. With a mixture of fear and fascination, I began to move slowly down the corridor. The doors on either side were closed, with nameplates that had long since rusted and become illegible. Despite my anxiety to get out, something was urging me to explore further, as if every part of that place hid pieces of the truth that the doctor's ghost wanted me to discover. Finally, I reached the end of the hallway, where a single door stood ajar. Cautiously, I pushed open the door, which creaked ominously on its hinges. Inside, the room was dark, lit only by the moon filtering through a broken window. The wind made the torn curtains dance, and as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I began to make out the figure of a woman standing, facing the window. Her presence was unsettling, and though she seemed not to notice my arrival, I felt a pressure in the air, as if charged with static electricity. "Who are you?" I asked in a voice that barely acknowledged me, shaky and low. Without turning around, the woman answered in a voice that sounded distant and melancholy. "I am one of the forgotten, one of those who were trapped within the confines of this place." She turned slowly toward me, her face was pale and her eyes reflected a deep sadness. "Like you now." Fear coursed down my back as I realized that it had not been a coincidence that I had come to this place. What do I need to do to leave this place? I asked, my voice now firmer, driven by the desire to escape and the need to understand. The woman walked toward me, each step echoing with an echo that did not seem to belong in this room. You must free those of us who have been trapped here. Only by facing and revealing the truth hidden in these walls will you be able to break the cycle that binds us. I understood that my arrival at this abandoned hospital had not been a simple accident. I was here for a reason, and the only way out was through solving the mysteries and sufferings buried in the history of the place. Armed with new determination, I nodded, ready to face whatever it took to unravel the truth and free not only those trapped, but also myself. As the woman disappeared, as if absorbed back into the shadows of the room, I turned to the window and looked out at the moon. I knew the night would be long and full of discovery. My journey was just beginning, and each revelation would be a step toward freedom, or toward a new enigma. Armed with the new mission the woman in the dark room had given me, I began to scour the hospital in search of any clues that might help me understand the events that had turned this place into a prison for lost souls. Each room seemed to contain fragments of untold stories, and as I investigated, I began to gather objects, faded photographs, musty personal journals, and strange medical artifacts that looked more like instruments of torture than healing. With each object uncovered, fragments of the stories of those trapped began to take shape. Through the pages of a journal found under a rusty bed, I discovered the story of a nurse who had worked at the hospital during its darkest years. She wrote of inhumane experiments disguised as medical treatments, of patients disappearing without a trace, and of how her own despair grew by the day. As the night wore on, my surroundings began to change subtly. The corridors narrowed and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. Strange sounds, like barely audible whispers, followed my every step, adding to the oppressive atmosphere of the place. It was as if the hospital was alive, reacting to my presence and my discovery of its deepest secrets. In a particularly desolate wing of the hospital, I found a room that looked like it had once been an operating room. Inside, the flickering light of my flashlight revealed walls stained with what could only be ancient blood and a series of operating tables arranged in a macabre circle. In the center, a large metal receptacle, rusted and stained, contained what appeared to be records and audio tapes of treatment sessions. Taking one of the cassettes, I placed it in an old player that I also found in the room. The tape began to play, and a doctor's voice broken by time filled the room, calmly talking about procedures and results, as if he were documenting scientific experiments without the slightest emotion. The coldness in his tone was chilling, and every detail he revealed drove me to keep searching, to keep uncovering the truth, not only for those trapped here, but for the justice the place demanded. I knew that each secret unearthed brought me closer to freedom, but I also understood that I was digging deeper into the darkness of the hospital, a darkness that was somehow beginning to feel familiar. The connection between this place and me was becoming clearer, and with each step toward the truth, I felt my own story intertwined with that of the ghosts that inhabited these halls. It was a journey not only outward, but also into the depths of my being. As the night wore on and the cold became more intense inside the hospital, the sounds and whispers increased, more and more audible, as if the structure itself was trying to communicate with me. Determined to confront what awaited me, I continued my exploration into the basement, the place from which all the rumors and legends seemed to emanate. The descent down the creaking staircase was nerve-wracking, each step echoed with an echo that seemed too prolonged to be normal. Upon reaching the bottom, the change in temperature was palpable. A piercing chill took over the atmosphere, and the air was permeated with a musty smell and something else, something I couldn't identify, but which sent shivers down my spine. The basement was a maze of narrow corridors and abandoned rooms filled with old medical equipment and scattered files. In one of these rooms, I found a large map of the hospital taped to the wall, covered with annotations and markings. It detailed each section with meticulous precision and showed a room marked in red, set apart from the others, labeled simply the core. My intuition told me that I would find the answers there. Guided by the map, I made my way to that area. The heavy metal doors were ajar, as if someone had left them that way on purpose. As I entered, a shiver ran through my body. The room was dominated by a central structure that resembled an altar, surrounded by chains hanging from the ceiling and an arrangement of oddly positioned mirrors that distorted light and shadows, creating disconcerting optical illusions. In the center of the altar, a thick book with a worn cover rested on a wooden lectern. With trembling hands, I opened the book and began to read. The pages were filled with handwritten accounts, confessions of a former hospital director describing in detail the experiments conducted in this sacred and forbidden place. He spoke of seeking immortality, of transcending life and death, of communicating with entities beyond our world. Each word absorbed me more deeply, sealing my connection to the horrors this place had witnessed. As I read, the whispers grew into clear, direct voices, not only in my head, but echoing through the room. Voices that told their stories, their sufferings, their unfulfilled desires. They were the souls of those who had been part of the inhuman experiments, seeking to be heard, to be understood. I knew then that I could not leave this place until those voices found peace. My fate was inexorably linked to that of this cursed hospital. With each discovery, each confession read, I became not only a witness but a guardian of its darkest secrets. Dawn was near, and with it, the decision to face what was to come, armed with the truth and a new resolve, to free these lost souls, no matter the cost. In the gloom of the basement, as the voices grew in intensity, I felt my own reality begin to distort. The room seemed to expand and contract with each whisper, each scream of the trapped souls echoing against the walls. I knew I had to act fast. Armed with the knowledge of the book, I discovered within its pages an ancient invocation, one that promised to free those whose lives had been sacrificed in the name of a forbidden and cursed science. Not knowing if it would work, but with hope as my ultimate ally, I began to recite the ancient words, each syllable vibrating in the charged air of the basement. As I uttered the invocation, the mirrors began to vibrate, and the chains hanging from the ceiling moved as if manipulated by unseen forces. A dim but growing light emanated from the altar, illuminating the room with a glow that seemed to have no physical source. Voices, now clamorous and desperate, seemed to plead for the deliverance my words promised. Suddenly, an icy wind swept through the room, and the mirrors exploded in a chorus of crystals that shone in the darkness like shooting stars. The chains shattered and fell to the floor with a clatter, and one by one, the voices began to fade, as if carried by the wind, leaving behind a silence I had not felt since I entered this cursed place. I looked around, expecting to be confronted by some horrific manifestation, but instead, I found peace. The basement was quiet now, the remnants of the mirrors reflecting only the normalcy of an abandoned room and not the distortions of a stormy reality. It was then that I saw it, in the midst of the calm chaos, a luminous specter materialized in front of the altar. It was not a threatening presence, but a serene, grateful one. The spirit of someone who had been part of the experiments, but who now, thanks to the ritual, had found peace. With an ethereal smile, he looked at me and nodded before vanishing into thin air, as if carried by a breeze that no one else could feel. I left the hospital at dawn, with the first sun illuminating the horizon. Behind me, the building no longer looked like a carcass of horrors, but simply a forgotten place, an echo of its dark past. As I walked to my car, I knew I had changed. Not only had I unraveled the hospital's mysteries, but I had freed its eternal prisoners and, in the process, found an unexpected purpose, to seek out and free others who, like them, waited in the darkness. With that new resolve in my heart, I closed the hospital door, leaving behind its secrets, but taking with me the certainty that there are more places like it, waiting to be discovered and released. And so, with the book under my arm, my journey was just beginning.